Okay, good morning, everyone. Okay, we are starting chapter 13. Today we are doing chapter 13, which is a continuation of the topic which the Alter Rebbe began in chapter 12, the topic for which the whole of Tanya was actually written, which is all about the Beinoni, right? So last chapter, chapter 12, after having explained what a tzaddik is, after having explained what a Russia is and how Russia operates, now the Alter Rebbe is going into the Beinoni. Chapter 12 began the whole concept of the Beinoni, and we described in chapter 12 how the Beinoni uses the tactic of Mayach Shalit al Alev, which is the mind which rules the heart, and in chapter 12, the Alter Rebbe explained to us how this is really easy when there is clarity, right? Now, it is also easy for the mind to rule over the heart when the mind, or otherwise known as the intellect, is involved in divine pursuits such as davening or learning Torah. Because in the Beinoni, the Yetzer Hara is not vanquished. The Yetzer Hara is not transformed, but it is merely subdued. So this is like a little extra detail, which can help us understand why when the Beinoni is in the middle of davening, for example, and he is involved in mental pursuits of praising Hashem, connecting to Hashem, understanding Hashem's greatness, his nefesh habahamis is subdued, dormant, and basically asleep at that moment. So mayach shalit al alev either needs clarity or needs to be involved. The mayach needs to be involved in divine pursuits, and therefore cannot be replaced by other pursuits at that given time. When mayach shalit al alev occurs, when the mind ruling the heart occurs, the divine soul can control the expression of the animal soul. It has dominance over the expression of the animal soul and not of the actual essence and nature of the animal soul, but it controls how the animal soul will think, speak, or do. And in the Beinoni, the animal soul is completely controlled. Now, what's interesting about this is that the feelings and opinions of the Nefesh Elokis, which are godly, right, do not have control over the feelings and opinions of the animal soul. So, therefore, when we say the mind rules over the heart, it's very important to make the distinction that the mind rules over the heart with regard to expression of the heart, but not of the feelings and opinions of the heart. Those remain as the animal soul. Those remain the same and do not get changed in the case of the Beinoni. So in the beginning of Tanya, when the Alter Rebbe was explaining how he is going to translate the terms tzaddik, Russia, Beinoni, right? The Alter Rebbe brought the colloquial meanings of these terms, as you know, up till Tanya, how people would use these terms to understand them. So a tzaddik would be someone who has a majority of mitzvahs, and a Russia would have a majority of sins. And how the Beinoni would be described would be zeh v'zeh shaitan, both the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov, the good inclination and the evil inclination, rules them. In other words, colloquially and traditionally speaking, the Beinoni would be somebody who has half mitzvahs and half averos, meaning the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov play an equal role in his life, and they both dominate him. But let's examine this a little bit closer, because the expression zeh v'zeh shaitan means this and this judges them, the Beinonis. It doesn't say rules them or dominates them, but rather that the Yetzer Tov, the good inclination, and the Yetzer Hara judges him. Now, we have to really understand that to understand exactly the inner workings of the Beinoni and how it occurs, right? And the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara are really the emotional aspect of both the Nefesh Elokis, the divine soul, and the Nefesh Abahamis. So they're both situated in the heart, and the evil inclination, the heart, we know, represents the emotions, not the intellect. And even though the divine soul is primarily in the intellect, but its emotions are in the heart, the right side of the heart. And the animal soul is definitely primarily in the heart, even though it's also in the intellect, but it's in the left ventricle of the heart. And that is where the Yetzer Hara is seated, which is the emotional attributes of the animal soul. Now, how does it work when there's a court case, let's say, for example, and there are three judges? Usually there's three judges. According to Judaism, there are three judges who will give a ruling. Why three? Because the majority rules. You can't have a majority when you have two, right? When you have three, there's always going to be a majority. So to explain this about judging, okay, in the case where there are three judges and a majority rules, what happens is that each one gives an opinion. Each one has a view of how things should work. The third opinion will determine the outcome. So here we have two. The Beinoni, we have a third opinion, because otherwise there cannot be a true judging. What is the third opinion in the case of the Beinoni? That is the opinion of Hashem. And it also represents the help that Hashem gives the Beinoni after he has made the first steps into deciding to overcome the Yetzer Hara, right? And this help of Hashem, the Yetzer Tov needs. The Yetzer Tov, the good inclination, or the right side of the heart in the Beinoni, would not be able to overcome the evil part of the Beinoni, which is in the left side of the heart. And remember that the word evil simply means the concealment of godliness. It is not holy, which is the revelation of godliness. But the good inclination, the revelation of holiness in the right side, and the emotions in the right side of the heart are not able to overcome the left side without the help of Hashem. It's a very important ingredient. So the way we are going to resolve the conflict between the two souls, and there is always a conflict between the two souls, is to bring in the third opinion, the Hashem's opinion. Because even when you decide to do a mitzvah, because of you, because I am deciding to do a mitzvah, right? There is a possibility of pride and arrogance, which doesn't come from the godly soul. Even also, this applies in the case of not sinning, right? Wow, good for me. I didn't sin, right? But it is not because of Hashem. So that is why, in the case of the Beinoni, when we say that there are two judges, we say that there are two opinions, really, and there's always a need for a third opinion, which is the help of Hashem in the case of the Beinoni. So when we're talking about my evil traits, my bad traits, my good traits, we're talking about me. But when I put myself aside, then we bring in Hashem. In other words, what does Hashem want? And it doesn't become a personal victory, but it's all from Hashem. So going back to the Beinoni again, the Beinoni, we say zeh v'zeh shoftan. Both the animal soul and the godly soul are its judges. The Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov are its judges, right? It should say Moishlim, that both rule him. Grammatically, that would be correct, but that would not be an ideal situation. We don't want to be dominated over by both the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov. In actual fact, it's not even a possibility for both of them to have dominance and therefore give expression to their desires and feelings and opinions, right? But in this case, each one gives an opinion, each one has feelings, and then the third arbitrator gives his opinion, which is the health of Hashem. Very importantly, first we put in the effort, and then Hashem steps in. Because remember, it is called the help of Hashem. Hashem doesn't do it for us, he helps us. And this is what we are aspiring to. It is, in fact, Hashem which gives the power to holiness, to Kedusha, to overcome darkness and evil. So in the Beinoni, and this is something we all aspire to because the Tanya was written for the Beinoni, Hashem helps that the evil becomes powerless, but not transformed, as in the case of a tzaddik, as we see when David HaMelech wrote in Tehillim, and he wrote about himself, he said, Libi chalal bekirbi, my heart is empty. In other words, David HaMelech, through his service of God, had completely vanquished his animal soul, and therefore there was an empty void in his heart. The animal soul was not existent. But that is not our avodah. Our avodah is to become a Beinoni, to simply subdue the animal soul, not to vanquish it or transform it, and specifically to subdue it in its expression. So also in the beginning of Tanya is something interesting that we read, is that the Alter Rebbe says that when a person is born, a person has to take an oath before coming into this world. And one of the things that the person is obliged to promise is to say that he should be in his eyes like a rasha. So Hayeh be'einecha ke rasha, like a rasha. And the question there goes on, say, wow, but if you're going to consider yourself a rasha, you might fall into depression and sadness, and that is not conducive to serving Hashem. So which one is it? Should you consider yourself a rasha? Should you not consider yourself a rasha? Right? But the distinction is, the Alter Rebbe explains in this chapter, that the wording of the oath is to not consider yourself a rasha, but to consider yourself like a rasha. And in other words, be a Beinoni who has an animal soul. This animal soul craves all the pleasures of this world, just like a rasha. So you recognize that you have that aspect in you, but in the Beinoni, it is powerless due to Hashem's help. And you're a Beinoni even if you didn't sin at all. You don't think that you're a tzaddik. You're like a rasha in the aspect that you have an animal soul. You're not a tzaddik. So taking down a notch, right? Not only that, to humble yourself further, says the Alter Rebbe, the Beinoni has to remember that his animal soul is actually being used constantly, and something that is being used constantly gains power. Where do we see that the Beinoni's animal soul is being used? It's being used in permissible activities such as eating, drinking, sleeping. It still functions as an animal soul. A Beinoni feels pain. The Beinoni feels tired. The Beinoni feels hungry and has to give attention to his animal soul. Yes, in a Beinoni, he does it for the sake of heaven. But his animal soul is still active. It still wants to have an important role in his life. And the Beinoni still uses his animal soul in eating, drinking, other mundane pursuits, and is therefore quite active, and therefore can awaken at any moment. This is the reflection that the Alter Rebbe inspires the Beinoni to have in this chapter, for the reason of preventing complacency in the Beinoni. Because what can happen is, when a person has reached a certain level in Hashem's in service of God, he can say, great, I've arrived. I have reached the goal, going to sleep, right? However, the Alter Rebbe advises, don't forget, you have this animal soul. You're even using your animal soul. And yes, you may be able to dominate the animal soul. You may be able to subdue the animal soul in its expression, but your animal soul is there. And that reflection is to prevent you from becoming complacent. And even a Beinoni who davens and learns all day long, and we explained in the last chapter that when a Beinoni davens, his animal soul is dormant. But even him, he is not a tzaddik. Why? Because a tzaddik is someone who despises evil completely. In the case of a tzaddik that is not complete, maybe there is a vestige of understanding evil. But in the Beinoni can relate to evil. He can understand evil. Only that he has subjugated the evil to Hashem's will. And that sage of the Gemara, Rabbah, made them, I am like a Beinoni. He didn't say I'm a tzaddik, because he was involved in the pursuit of Torah learning all day long, and he believed that his animal soul was dormant instead of transformed. Now, one could start thinking that if this is the case, that the animal soul can awaken at any moment, or that the Beinoni actually has this animal soul that, don't forget, causes him to have thoughts of sin, but those are involuntary, subconscious thoughts, one can make the mistake in thinking that the service of Hashem of a Beinoni may not be truthful, because he's battling his animal soul. The animal soul may be dormant, but especially during davening. But what happens when the animal soul awakens? So is your love of Hashem not true? That's because maybe it lacks consistency, right? We all love to. The Yetzer Hara loves this tactic, like, oh, are you a hypocrite now? Like 5 minutes ago you were all inspired, and now you're sinning. Like, this is kind of a hypocritical situation to be in. And the Beinoni takes that a notch higher by saying, oh, 1 second. A minute ago you were davening and your animal soul was sleeping, but now your animal soul is really awake and feeling all the desires and pleasures of this world, right? Your love of Hashem may not be constant, may not be consistent. So is it true? And the answer is yes, it is true. And the difference between the Beinoni and the Rasha, in this case, is because a Beinoni, because of the level that he has reached, is able to activate his love of Hashem in order to subdue the animal soul at any time he wants. In actual fact, what is a Beinoni doing during davening? He's due to the love he feels in the right side of his heart. So it's true that he's not davening and involved in worldly matters at this moment, perhaps, but if he wants, he can activate that love at any given moment, whereas a Rasha struggles to activate this love. There is a Beinoni who davens all day, and then there is also a Beinoni who has reached the level while being involved in worldly pursuits, but yet it is as if he davens all day. So in other words, his davening affects his day, because in other words, we are saying over here there's a Beinoni, there's such a high level of a Beinoni that his animal soul is basically dormant all day long. And within this category, there are two types: one who actually davens all day long, and one who davens and is involved in worldly pursuits, but it is as if he davens all day long. So his Beinoni is dormant. Sorry, his animal soul is dormant. And Tanya emphasizes that the goal is not to reach one or the other, but the goal is that each person should reach their level according to their capacity of their neshama. The goal, in other words, is not to daven all day long, but to reach the level where you are fulfilling your entire potential. A Rasha cannot always awaken this love of Hashem. It is not available to him. So just to recap something interesting, because the Alter Rebbe has now given us a number of tools that the Beinoni actually uses to overcome his inclinations of his animal soul. And those tools, there are three tools so far. The one tool is Mayach Shalit El Alev, which we discussed last chapter, and that needs clarity. So that is when the divine soul, the intellect of the divine soul, overcomes the desires and feelings of the animal soul in the manner of expression, not necessarily the feelings. We don't actually transform the feelings, but we do control the expression of it. The second tactic is, okay, now we have to choose good. So how do we do that? We elicit Hashem's help. That's the second tool. Hashem's powers of holiness being stronger than evil. So in other words, when we are struggling between good and evil, and sometimes it's not even clear which one is good, which one is evil, we can say we need a third opinion, which is Hashem's opinion, which is the strength of holiness over evil. And the third tactic is davening, because during davening, the Beinoni's animal soul is dormant. And whereas we are not yet Beinonis, we definitely can aspire to become one. That is the whole point of Tanya. And so we can definitely say that our davening can have an effect, if not only at the moment of davening, for the whole day as well. In other words, what we are saying here is that the love of Hashem in a Beinoni is truthful. It may not be revealed at all times. It may not be the constant fiery love at all times, but it is on his level. A Beinoni is conscious of his body. He knows when he's hungry. He knows when he's in pain. He's conscious of the desires of his animal soul, but then because he's conscious of it and he's conscious of the desires and feelings and opinions of the godly soul, he then chooses not to pursue the desires and feelings of the animal soul by remembering Hashem's will. And by remembering that Hashem's intention is different. In other words, what is a Beinoni? A Beinoni is aware of his body, and he's also aware of godliness at the same time. And he has true free choice. True free choice means that it is not based on cultural preferences or biases from childhood or any other expectations. It is very clear to the Beinoni what is Hashem's will and desire and what the body and animal soul is desiring and choosing and wanting to do at that moment. And he chooses Hashem's will over the animal soul. So this chapter, this is a very brief overview of this chapter. This chapter is really worth reading inside for any of you who want to do that. It gives us more of an insight into the workings of the Beinoni, the power of davening, and how the inner workings of a Beinoni are, which is more similar to the Rasha than to a Tzaddik. Whereas outwardly, a Beinoni is more similar to the Tzaddik, his inner workings are actually much more similar and much more relatable to the Rasha, which is why us potential Beinonis can really aspire to become a full-fledged Beinoni. At Tzaddik, that is not our mission, but to become from a Rasha, to go from the level of a Rasha where there is the possibility of sinning, in other words, the possibility of letting the animal soul and the emotional attributes of the animal soul dominate in expression as well. We can aspire to the level of the Beinoni by using all these different tools like mind over heart, eliciting the help of Hashem, davening, in order to aspire to become a Beinoni. And if not a complete Beinoni, but at least some Beinoni moments. Any questions or observations?
I'm sorry, as you're talking, so I'm thinking of a sumptuous feast, okay? I'm thinking of the tzaddik and the benini and the rasha sitting at this feast. So are you, because I don't know why I put everything into food, but so are you saying the benini would recognize that this beautiful food is from Hashem and be able to eat it at that level without, I guess, overindulging? Like I'm not quite sure. Like, does a tzaddik sit at that feast and not even recognize the beautiful, or just eat for sustenance? Like how? Like,
Okay, so that's a really, really good question and a good example of explaining the difference between a Rasha, Benoni, and Tzaddik, right? So a tzaddik is completely in alignment with Hashem's will, right? So a tzaddik knows that in order to survive in this world, he needs to eat. So he's definitely not feeling his hunger per se. He is wanting to serve Hashem. So interestingly, the Baal Shem Tov says that when a person is hungry and we feel hunger, we say, I want to eat, right? It's not actual hunger, but it's the godly soul wanting to say a bracha. So in the case of the tzaddik, it doesn't have any importance. Food doesn't take any. I mean, for me, for example, food is really important. But in the case of a tzaddik, food doesn't occupy any level of importance for him. What does occupy importance for him is serving Hashem. So he just eats. He doesn't think about it. He says a bracha. He praises Hashem. He draws down. Bracha means drawing down Hashem into this world. He draws down Hashem, but doesn't really think about it too much, right? The Rasha, on the other hand, looks at this feast and says, wow, oh my gosh, look at all this food. I'm starving. It's really good. I'm going to now feed myself. I'm not going to stop when I'm full. I'm going to gluttonously eat, because how can I just leave all the delicious delicacies on the table? And goes and feeds his animal soul completely. He may forget even to say a bracha. And even if he says a bracha, he's eating gluttonously. And he's really, really feeding his animal soul. And his animal soul is deriving great pleasure out of this feast. The Benoni has a look at the feast and says, wow, this is great. Like, these are a lot of good food over here. I understand that the Nefesh Habahamis wants to, party and go crazy over here. But I'm a Benoni. So what Hashem wants is that I should eat in order to serve Hashem. So the Benoni will say a bracha, will just eat what is necessary for him to serve Hashem, will not eat gluttonously, will be elevating the food in that way. Does that make it clearer to you? It's like the example that I always give about the jewelry store or whatever store is out of a person's reality. A tzaddik will walk past the store and not even see the store, right? The Rasha will walk past the store and start scheming how to attain whatever is in that store by robbing a bank, smashing the window, whatever it is. And the Benoni will walk by and say, that's a nice piece of jewelry or a pocketbook, whatever it is, but knows that it's not in his reality. He does not even conflict it, and he just walks by, but he has an understanding of the pleasure involved in such an object. Whereas the tzaddik has no understanding. And not only does the tzaddik have no understanding, he despises anything that conceals Hashem. So that's why the tzaddik just eats the minimum, doesn't really think about it too much. He's not involved. Go ahead.
okay, two things. One is that my brain goes to a very straight, like, so then you would think that all tzaddiks were skinny because they were, well, they were never overindulging, correct? Like that's where my brain has. And then also wasn't I'm really not trying to be disrespectful, but wasn't one of the rebbeim, one of our rabbis, like really into the gashmias, but he was a tzaddik, wasn't he?
Yeah, because that was the Rebbe Maharash.
Right.
Rebbe Maharash was extremely wealthy.
Uh-huh.
But you see, here's the difference between a tzaddik and a Rasha. A tzaddik, everything that Hashem has in this world is to be used for serving him, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a Rasha doesn't necessarily use the wealth to serve Hashem. He uses the wealth. And by the way, remember that a Rasha could be someone who serves Hashem most of the time and occasionally sins, right? He's just called a Rasha because there's a possibility of sinning. right? So we cannot say that Russia might even be using most of his money and his wealth to serve God, but sometimes,
Mhm.
he doesn't, right? We can't say that about the tzaddik. So the tzaddik, in the case of the Reb Maharash, and there are a lot of explanations why he used his wealth and why he was wealthy, but the main reason was because he used his wealth to serve Hashem.
Mhm.
In fact, he really had tremendous wealth, but that was an example of someone who uses his wealth completely for the purpose of serving Hashem. It wasn't for his good. He elevated the wealth. He elevated the money. He elevated the Gashmias, which we can do also, but not completely. We can't transform, right? And it's funny because here in Brazil, I also once had a student in my class who also asked me, well, all religious people then should be skinny. Why are they all, why are so many religious people not skinny? Well, guess what? I told her, well, we all have Yetzer Hara as well. We're not tzaddikim, but there are also different parameters through generations of what constituted healthy. So, for example, we even have a case of the Rebbeim, for example, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe smoked.
Mhm.
Like, what do you mean? Smoke. He actually stopped smoking. I think that even the Rebbe smoked until the Frierdiker Rebbe told him, like, what do you need it for? And then, like, they smoked. There was a different conception and understanding in the times of what constituted health, right? So smoking was not considered unhealthy at a certain time. Maybe being overweight was not considered unhealthy. So I can't really explain that to you 100%, right? We know, for example, the Rebbe ate chalk for energy because we spent many, many hours just standing. For example, just take the line of dollars. The Rebbe spent hours and hours and hours as an elderly man without taking a break for nature, right? Which is not really in the realm of a human being. On the other hand, the Rebbe ate chocolate for energy. We do know that. So I can't 100% explain to you, but I can explain to you that everything that a tzaddik does, he transforms and is for the sake of Hashem. And if I find anything else out about this topic, I will get back to you. Anything else? Any other observations? Okay, so we'll see everybody next week. Rest Hashem. Take care.